Good morning and welcome, everyone. I think we are ready to start our webinar. Welcome to the webinar on transitional justice and artificial intelligence, where we will examine the relationship between artificial intelligence and transitional justice. My name is Simone Naidu. I work at the Institute for Justice and Reconciliation, and I will be co-hosting you today on this webinar. Just to let you know, the program for today, I will do the welcome. I've got my colleague Felicity Harrison. She'll give us an overview of today's webinar. And then we've got Professor Tim Marithi, one of our speakers who will speak for 20 minutes. Professor Tim is a professor at the Stellenbosch University, as well as the University of the Free State. He's also a research associate at the University of Cape Town and Wits University, with over 3 decades of experience in transitional justice, peace, security, and governance in Africa. He has held key academic and research positions. He has served as an advisor and consultant to the African Union and the United Nations, among others. I also want to welcome Jenna Lee Stragnell. She is a dedicated peace builder and the co-founder and director of Tales of Turning, a South African non-profit pioneering digital peace building and community healing across the globe. With a master's degree in peace studies and a background in narrative therapy, her global work spans from South Africa to Somalia and Zimbabwe. Today, she is at the forefront of combining generative dialogue with human-led AI to address online mis and disinformation and hate speech. Welcome, Jenna. Welcome as one of our speakers, and Professor Tim. We look forward to an insightful and an interesting conversation exploring these two components. I'd like to hand over to my colleague Felicity Harrison. She will give us a little bit of a deep dive and a focus into today's webinar.
Thank you so much, Simone, and thank you to everybody who is here. We want to especially welcome the participants online. We know that you have a very busy schedule, and we appreciate the time that you are taking today to join us. In looking at this particular topic, one of the things that we wanted to explore was the opportunities and threats of AI. We are meeting at a particularly important moment when artificial intelligence is rapidly transforming how information is gathered, analyzed, archived, and shared across the world. In the field of transitional justice, these technologies offer many exciting possibilities for strengthening documentation, supporting truth-seeking processes, preserving historical memory, and improving accountability for human rights violations. Yet at the same time, they also raise significant ethical, legal, and practical concerns that cannot be ignored. Amongst the key challenges are the risks of algorithmic bias, the spread of deepfake and misinformation, threats to privacy and sensitive survivor data, and questions about transparency, accountability when AI systems influence decision-making. There are also important concerns about unequal access to technology, the potential marginalization of vulnerable communities, and the danger of allowing automated systems to replace human judgment and lived experiences that are so central to the transitional justice processes. As we explore these issues today, we will consider how AI can be used responsibly to support truth, justice, reparations, memory, all while ensuring that victim-centered approaches, human rights principles, and ethical oversight remain at the heart of any technological innovation. We are very fortunate to have distinguished experts to share their perspectives and experiences, and their insights will help us think critically both about the opportunities and the threats that AI presents in transitional justice settings. We would also like to encourage people to use the question and answer function. We have left about half an hour for interaction. And we would very much like this not just to be a webinar of presentations, but also of interaction and really going deeply into the questions that are before us. On that note, I'm going to hand over to Professor Tim for his presentation. Thank you once again for being with us.
Thank you so much, Felicity. I hope that everyone can hear me clearly, and thank you to Felicity, Simone Mwanja for organizing this very engaging webinar on the nexus between AI and transitional justice and how, in fact, AI can support TJ. I think the first thing to say is that transitional justice is a very human-centered process or a set of processes. And so in that respect, at least in the near term and the medium term, it's one can actually say quite clearly that AI will not be able to replace and cannot replace human actors, human intervention, human empathy in processes that are very relational, that require what we call ultimately healing and reconciliation. It's very much an interpersonal process and requires people to accompany other people in their journey to deal with the past. So transitional justice essentially seeks to deal with the past, especially past violations, human rights atrocities, and utilizes mechanisms such as truth-seeking, truth recovery, mechanisms such as truth commissions, that we have the South African Truth and Reconciliation Commission, for example. It also utilizes processes of redress and accountability, so restorative justice, retributive or punitive criminal justice, and then also processes of institutional reform and constitutionalism as we set up systems of democracy. So in that respect, TJ is very much, as I said, a human-centered process. And in the medium term, it's highly unlikely that AI can, in fact, replace human interventions in terms of TJ. But AI can help societies, in particularly societies across Africa, to deal with the legacy of conflict, authoritarianism, mass human rights violations, um, by providing that additional capacity to process information, identify potential risks, provide analysis that can inform the decision makers of the right path to take. But let me first probably start with the threats, because I think there's always two sides to the coin, and AI does introduce a number of threats in the sense that it also provides the prospects in terms of the way AI is programmed. It does provide the prospects for AI to be utilized to actually divide societies in much more profound ways, by targeting ethnic divisions or ideological divisions. And in fact, we're already seeing that at the moment around the world, where algorithms have divided societies, have divided people into different constituencies, and people are very happy, particularly on social media, to exist almost entirely in a bubble, in an ideological bubble, without interrogating different perspectives, which is exceptionally dangerous for societies. And AI has contributed to that. Secondly, AI can also be misused by governments, other nefarious actors, to actually surveil societies. We talk about surveillance capitalism at the moment. We talk about data privacy violations. The whole issue of data sovereignty has come to the surface, about people, in fact, having a right to maintain their own data. And every time we interface with AI, we actually provided additional data that ultimately can be utilized against us. And globally, we haven't established the guardrails that are going to enable us to be able to actually regulate this in an effective way. And also, AI can actually exclude communities that don't have digital access. I mean, in Africa, we know that 600 million of our fellow Africans do not have access to electricity. And also, in terms of the programming of AI languages, a predominant amount of that work is being done outside of the African continent and then being imported. So we do have to be very careful about becoming dependent on non-African technology or non-African data programming language that, in fact, essentially undermines our ability to generate culturally relevant AI to support processes such as transitional justice on the continent. So that's the bad news. And then in that regard, one of the key recommendations definitely going forward is how we can strengthen regulation of AI. And I'll say a little bit about that towards the end. But moving back to transitional justice, I think it's important to, I think, as Felicity has already mentioned, that AI has a tremendous capacity to help us, for example, do some of the technical work that's required around TJ, standardizing and collecting digital evidence data that is stored in vast databases that help with evidence collection, verification of human rights violations and atrocities. It can also create systems of knowledge exchange that enable best practices to be shared across borders and in regions and continentally. We do have the African Union Transitional Justice Policy, which is a policy framework adopted by the African Union in February 2019 that is not very well known, in fact, around the world. And so AI can play a role in making this policy much more familiar to a larger group of African people. There are opportunities for leveraging AI to, in fact, strengthen our work in transitional justice. And let me focus on the African continent. But in order to get to that point, we do need to develop African language AI models that are more relevant to victims and survivors, particularly in the rural areas. And this does require some work at the policy level to be able to interface with some of the decision-making structures that we have. And AI definitely has a very strong capacity or role to, as I mentioned, provide analytical support for digitization, preservation of archives, and also supporting, for example, in the cases of accountability and justice mechanisms, and strengthening the capacity of courts to identify particularly forensic analysis of mass graves, ballistic evidence, missing persons, so on and so forth. AI can also support reparations, restorative justice processes by enabling a much more dedicated mapping of beneficiaries, providing an assessment of that, and also providing, at least identifying how victims and survivors can source a human support when it comes to mental health, psychosocial support, particularly in societies that are deeply traumatized. And then looking at the institutional reform dimension of transitional justice, AI has a very strong capacity to obviously provide a diagnosis of policy analysis, and also to document hotspots, incidences of hate speech, election-related detentions, and monitoring of the implementation of policies that are actually relevant for institutionalization of democracy and protection of constitutionalism. In that regard, AI can also quite strongly support public participation and inclusion. I did mention there are constraints in parts of Africa where our fellow Africans don't have access to electricity. It does limit the ability to utilize these systems, but that's part of the role of how do we, in fact, make this more accessible to all. Digital platforms can enable citizens to even interface directly with the decision makers, and there's a huge gap between the political leaders of the continent and the people. And I believe that AI can close this gap if it's utilized in ethical ways. So these are some of the issues that do emerge around this issue of AI and TJ. In terms of creating a regulatory framework, I think there's a recent initiative to establish a world AI cooperation organization in Shanghai, which is going to be operationalized moving forward. I think it's the first structure of its kind that has aspirations to be global. It's not yet fully a universal body, but it's moving in the right direction. We also have within the African continent an African Union policy framework, or at least set of guidelines on AI that seek to create AI that has integrity, that is also culturally relevant to the African continent, and seeks to do no harm rather than to be manipulated for for political advantage. And so these are some of the issues that we need to focus on moving forward in terms of policy. How do we create the regulatory framework to ensure that AI is not abused to undermine societies, but in fact becomes a tool that is accessible to a vast or the widest number of people, particularly through open source platforms, to enable societies and governments to actually heal their societies from the violations of the past. And linked to that is the issue of, in fact, thinking outside the box of how AI can be programmed in different languages such as Swahili, Amharic, Hausa, Zulu, Xhosa, so on and so forth. It's something that we haven't applied a lot of thinking to, and this enables it to become culturally more relevant to the African continent. So as I conclude, let me say that AI, as I said, it cannot be a replacement for the very essential work that human beings do in terms of transitional justice. We need human judgment, human analysis, human empathy, allyship in terms of transitional justice processes. But AI can contribute to providing at least this technical dimension of making evidence collection, data analysis much more effective. That will, and also closing the gap between governments and their people in terms of platforms for engagement. And globally, I think we should also look at how continentally we can interface with other parts of the world and learn from their processes as well when it comes to AI and societal relational processes such as transitional justice going forward as we continue on this journey of building a much more peaceful and democratic future for the whole of humanity. Okay, let me stop there, and I thank you for your attention. Thank you. Jenna, are you going to go straight through? I think just carry on unless Simone's coming back. Okay.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Tim. Yes, we'll now hand over to Gina Lee, and we look forward to your presentation.
Thanks so much. It's a great honor to speak here with you today, Professor Tim, and really interesting listening to the depth of what you have to say. And so, as we hear from Professor Tim, how AI is really is used to spread mis and disinformation and hate speech. It's also used to cause polarization and increase tension. So it becomes really difficult to have the genuine dialogues that we need to have. And it is also leading to offline violence. And in the context of transitional justice, it's also distorting our stories with disinformation and manipulating narratives. So what I'm going to share now is really a case study of how AI is affecting our communities and social cohesion, And it's really relevant to the current context of South Africa. So Tales of Turning is a nonprofit organization. I'm one of the directors. My background is in psychology and narrative therapy. I also have masters in peace building. The other two directors are Stefan Snell and Jeffrey Mamputa, who are very experienced conflict mediators. They were part of the anti-apartheid movement, the peace accord, the transition to democracy in South Africa, and they've continued to mediate conflicts with gangs, taxis, and also continued to support the IEC with its peace building capabilities. So all of this is really to say that at the heart of our organization is a deep understanding of people. And we have then looked at the intersection between this deep understanding of people and technology and social media. So how can we take that technology and social media and work at that intersection to reach people at scale? We are living in a global information ecosystem where mis and disinformation and polarization and the distortion of our narratives is leading to an erosion of trust in elections, voter suppression, polarization. It's undermining public health. It's leading to offline violence, and it's silencing voices. And AI has really amplified the capacity for mis and disinformation. So it's become really easy using AI to create really real looking social media accounts with histories and real looking profile pictures, and also to really generate a lot of false narratives that have nuanced differences that can't be picked up by spam detectors. And AI bots also have the capability to have chats and continue the conversation that people are trying to have and not get tired, because it's obviously a bot. So it's really amplifying the extent of disinformation. And with its rapid advancement, it's hard to keep up with the developments. Also, of course, we have deep fakes now, where you can have really real looking images that are part of disinformation, and they're generated by AI. So the example I'm going to use is the recent anti-immigrant sentiment in South Africa. So what we do is we use social media listening tools to pull in all the data from public social media. And then we analyze this so we can find what people are talking about, how they're thinking about different issues, how they're grappling with these issues. It allows us to see when there's spikes in mis and disinformation and hate speech, when there's warning signs of violence. So it also lets us build early warning systems, as well as understanding the narratives and the different themes. By having these deep understandings of the narratives, it also provides us with entry points to dialogues. So in the recent anti-immigrant sentiment and in the lead up to the 30th of June protests, we were pulling in the public social media content and doing an analysis on it. So we found that anger was one of the lead indicators and warning signs of offline action and offline violence. You can see how the anger spiked in the lead up to the 30th of June protests. Other key indicators was that there was an increase in dangerous speech indicators, which include hate speech and inflammatory rhetoric. So these spiked in the lead up to the 30th of June protests, and then there was a dip. Possibly the dip is because of warnings from the government and a calming in the rhetoric of certain organizations. But there was an increase in individual threats to individuals that continued to rise right up into the protests. So when we're building the early warning systems for offline violence, because the as you'll see from my presentation, and I think we're all quite aware of, is that the anti-immigration sentiment is very coordinated. While there are very real concerns that people have, there's also a very coordinated network. So we want, and it's very related to the upcoming elections. So in the lead up to the elections, we want to continuously be monitoring and have an early warning system so that if there is a potential for violence, we are alerted to it before offline violence occurs. Also very significant, and you'll see why it's so significant when I talk about our interventions, is that there was really a lack of positive content about foreign nationals in a lead up to the protest. So you can see the green at the bottom, and that shows that there was just really a flat, very low amount of positive content. And then the red on the graph is the negative content. And you can see how that spiked and increased in the lead up to the 30th of June protest. And so what the report suggests is that had there been more positive content that was amplified, it could have really shifted the conversation and also possibly the offline situation. So in our analysis of the public social media content, there was a lot of signs of mis and disinformation. So we used software to do a network analysis, and we found that 27% of the conversation was coordinated by disruptor accounts or bots. And so this was a very manipulated and coordinated part of the conversation that then pulled in the general public into this coordinated conversation. So what is also suggested in this analysis that had there not to be such a 27% of the conversation that was so manipulated and coordinated with this information, and that was pulling in the general public, the conversation would look very different. Also in the network analysis, you can see the clusters of disinformation and how they're working together. So the clusters on the left are all South African accounts. And you can see clusters of coordinated disinformation. So with accounts seeding the disinformation and the other accounts resharing it, and how these clusters are working together. So there's high levels of coordination. Also very interestingly, on the right is international accounts that are international movements and white supremacist accounts that are seeding disinformation around foreign nationals. And you can see how that's related to the South African network and how they are feeding in to that disinformation. So that connection also needs further analysis and looking into. So what we do with all these reports is that, and the network analysis is that obviously there are so many incredible organizations on the ground working to prevent attacks against foreign nationals and to prevent violence. And so what we do is we share these reports and findings widely so it can support the on-the-ground work. And then we also use them for our own interventions. So what we've done is we've taken conflict mediation and psychology and what you would do in in-person dialogues and adapted them to the online environment. And there's three pillars to this approach. The first one is calming the conversation. The second one is deepening the conversation. And the third one is amplifying the positive. We developed a methodology called social truth queries. And what this is going onto social media, and when there is a post that looks like disinformation, asking a question like, is this true? Where did you get this information from? Are you for real? So it's really just posing a question. And what we found is that we've done 3 studies with the University of Washington and the University of Zurich, that this shows that this prevents the spread of mis and disinformation by up to 82%. I love the graph on the screen because it shows how it calms the conversation. So the blue is where the truth query is applied, and the gray is the control group where it's not applied. And you can see how it decreases the likelihood that people will share the disinformation, trust it, or believe in its accuracy. There's also neuroscience behind this. So, well, it's a really simple technique of asking a question. When we know that mis and disinformation makes us angry and afraid, so it emotionally dysregulates us. When we are emotionally dysregulated, the critical thinking part of our brain shuts down. A simple question reignites that critical thinking part of our brain. So it just gives us that moment pause to think, do we really want to be sharing this? And why this is particularly relevant to many of the disinformation efforts, but particularly the anti-immigration sentiment, is that there's very real conversations to be had. People have very real trauma, very real grievances, very real pain. But when there is, and for us to really look at next steps and work together, we have to have very deep dialogues about the way forward. But disinformation makes people so angry and afraid that it's very hard to have those real dialogues. And because it's so prolific and so coordinated, it's really muddied the waters for us to have the real conversations that we need to have. So that's why we're at scale looking at calming the conversation so we can have those deeper dialogues. And that's the next phase. The next phase is deepening the conversation. So again, the in-person dialogues that many community-based organizations are having on the ground are so important in deepening the conversation. And then we also know how much time people are spending on social media and how that is a site for polarization. And it's also shaping people's attitudes and beliefs. So how can we take these very real, on the ground, incredible dialogues and influence the social media space and get people to have dialogues on the social media space? So what we do is we've taken psychology and conflict mediation and what you would do in in-person dialogues and adapted that to the online space. So it's listening to really understand the other person's perspective, asking them curious questions to really go deeper into why they're feeling the way they are and what are their lived experiences that have led them to feel this way. And then continuing the conversation to ask curious questions to get them to reflect on some of the harmful beliefs that they may have. Because of the success of this, we've started using AI to amplify our efforts with a human in the loop. So what we've done is we've trained people in these methodologies. We've trained peer educators, community-based organizations, university students. We've also done training across Africa and Somalia and Zimbabwe. And so we have people that are now experienced in this methodology. They've done the training, they've done a mentorship programs. We also have practical online sessions that they join. So what the AI does is it detects mis and disinformation and harmful speech on public social media. It's trained in our methodology to suggest a response. And then there's a human in the loop who is the trained digital dialogue facilitators who volunteer to then take a look and see if the post is appropriate, if they would like to post it, or if they would like to edit it. And so this is a really great way to keep it ethical by having a human in the loop, but to start scaling up the methodology. The third part of the approach is amplifying the positive. So what we do is we take a narrative approach that communities are the experts of their own lives. They know their problems and their solutions best. So we work very closely with communities, as well as using the data and insights from the social media, the public social media research. And we work with communities to co-create new narratives. So we look at how can we amplify communities' voices? How can we amplify these dialogues? And how can we co-create new narratives where everyone's voices are seen and heard and that everyone belongs? So using this narrative therapy approach, we look for sparkling moments. When are the exceptional outcomes when violence and hatred is not present? Where are outcomes where foreign nationals and South Africans are working together? And what are the conditions that are happening there that we can, in those instances, that we can amplify and support? We also use hope-based narratives when we are creating social media content. So instead of focusing on fear, we focus on hope. We focus on what we're for instead of what we're against. We look at people as heroes rather than victims, and we focus on the solution and opportunities rather than the problems and threats. So what this looks like in practice is that we have workshops with community-based organizations. We show them some of the data, and we look at their narratives that they would like to amplify on social media. After that, we create unbranded social media content and create that into a toolkit. And we disseminate that widely to our digital dialogue facilitators, to our network of peace builders across South Africa and globally, and also to civil society organizations. And because it's unbranded, everyone's welcome to use it, and it can really be used to amplify positive narratives on social media. Here are some examples. So you can see that they're designed to blend in with social media. They're not high-level advertising content. We've done that on purpose because we found that that allows people to engage more with the content. It sparks dialogue, it sparks deep thinking. And we also use colloquial language and the different South African languages in our content. I picked these examples on purpose because they really look at an underlying part of violence, and that cuts across different forms of violence, whether it be gender-based violence, xenophobia, or even violence around elections, is that there's a lot of expectations on men to be providers and always to be strong. And this leads men to bottle up their emotions and not to seek help or mental health support when they need it. And this is one of the underlying causes of violence. So in this project, we were really looking at, there was a lot of conversation on social media, really calling for men to be recognized for other aspects they contribute to community, like caregiving or support, helping in community street watches and different ways that they contribute to their community rather than only being a financial provider. And also a call for men to be vulnerable and reach out for mental health support so that the situation doesn't escalate to violence. So we made these designs around that. And then also specific to what I was presenting on today is that there is quite a level of consciousness in civil society and government and conversations around how in the anti-foreign national sentiment, how there is a lot of coordination. So while there are very real grievances and trauma and issues that need to be addressed, that this is a very coordinated effort to undermine our elections. And we were thinking, how do we make people aware of that? How do we make more people aware of that? That yes, there are real issues that need to be addressed, and yes, we acknowledge their pain, but their pain and trauma is being mobilized for political gain and for geopolitical gain that is not actually going to benefit South Africans, that is not going to help with unemployment or their children's education and the very real problems that people are facing. So these are short little social media designs that we created. This is just a sample of 3 of them that we could use online and amplify to get people thinking of how this is a very coordinated attempt. And then we have networks of peace builders, as I mentioned, that we are working with in South Africa and globally, that we're really looking to do this at scale. The disinformation is so coordinated. And how do we get people to use their incredible peace building skills online at scale? So thanks so much.
Thank you very much, Jenna Lee and Professor Tim. That was very, very insightful and I must say very, very interesting and really good to see and good to know that there are things that we can do, practical things and simple things that we can do that can actually bring about a change, a positive change. Professor Tim, I know we will allow for questions and answers now, so I will allow participants online to please share your questions. If you have any questions for Professor Tim or Jenna Lee through the chat, please send your questions through and that we could then have a look at your questions and have them answered. But key messages that I picked out from your presentations, and hopefully this is seen as in an optimistic way, to also bring us back to ourselves. Professor Tim, what I appreciated or what I heard was that AI it basically reflects our existing political and our social inequalities, and that transitional justice contexts require particularly strong safeguards, and that human judgment and ethical oversight remains essential, with AI or not, but that remains essential. And that also victim-centered and rights-based approaches must guide all AI deployment. And then with Jenna Lee, I thought your presentation also complemented well on a more individual and a community-based approach to what Professor Tim had shared with us. And I really appreciate the narrative approach and how, as an individual, one can actually see and be empowered to know that we still have power to contribute to either bring about a negative environment, experience, an event, or we can contribute responsibly and think about our participation in bringing about change and positive change in our communities, in our families, in our homes, as well as in our nation, you know. So thank you so much. It was really nice to see from a practical and also in the field experience, looking at the recent xenophobia march and how you were able to actually do an analysis on that, as well as use AI to even counter any of the negative uprisings that have occurred, but how we can also use this in other events and other activities. So thank you so much for that. I don't see any questions in the chat as yet, but perhaps I will pose two questions for each, and we will have questions come from the participants online. For Professor Tim, with the rise of deepfakes, synthetic media, and AI-generated content, how can investigators and justice institutions safeguard the integrity of evidence and historical narratives? I don't know if that's too much of a loaded question, but it would be quite, even in a small way, to know how that can actually look like in practical in the reality. And also, if you could also recommend one key principle that should guide the use of AI in transitional justice over the next decade, what would it be and why? And then for Gina Lee, you've shared some really great practical steps that civil society organizations, content creators can use to use social media and AI responsibly, while ensuring in authenticity, protecting valuable communities, and maintaining public trust. What practical advice would you give to activists, communicators, and justice practitioners who want to use AI in their social media to work without compromising ethical standards or the integrity of their messaging? And I suppose one could also be adopting the narrative approach, and as you said, you are teaching individuals how to use this approach. So perhaps that could be one. And then also, yeah, I think you've shared from your experience in the social media space, how is AI changing the way stories about justice? You've shared that with us. Yeah. And then we've got one question. To what extent do current African AI governance frameworks account for the environmental impacts of AI deployment in transitional justice and post-conflict reconstruction? So I think that would be a question for Professor Tim. Professor Tim, if you'd like to go ahead, and then Gina afterward.
Sure. Thank you, Simone, for those questions. Much appreciated. Um, and also for the question that come through from the chat. So the first question I think you posed was around deepfakes and how, in fact, AI can misrepresent reality, at least through video documentary evidence. And this is very real. It's something we deal with almost on a regular day basis, even when some of us are doom scrolling, as we shouldn't be doing. We end up seeing many images and wonder, is this AI or is this real? And I think for investigators, it does become a challenge. So we cannot rely on secondary data collection in this regard, or data representation, let me put it that way. And one way to clearly safeguard evidence and to ensure that it is in fact real is to undertake the very basic process of primary data collection, which requires going out to the actual people that have been affected and engaging with human respondents. So in this regard, I think it actually demonstrates that transitional justice is very much a granular and on the ground process at its core. It's not something that can be done remotely or via video in totality. Parts of it, a key part of it is, in fact, engaging with people who have been affected by violence and atrocities and listening to them and learning from them and documenting their evidence. So that's really the best way to safeguard against AI being manipulated visually, which is happening increasingly. And then in terms of your question around principles, I think in South Africa we're well known for this principles of Ubuntu. We are human beings through other human beings. So in that sense, there's a deep underlying interconnectedness. This has been also demonstrated by quantum mechanics that has actually shown that there is an underlying quantum entanglement between all particles around the world. So essentially, we are one people, and it's the separation, the illusion of separation. Our individuality sometimes gets the better of us. We tend to move in that direction rather than working towards what the issues that unite us and the issues that we have in common as human beings. We have a society that's still very much polarized, as Jenna Lee's excellent presentation has illustrated. So, if there was a principle that I would say we need to make sure is evident in our AI programming, as far as AI programming relates to transitional justice is concerned, I would say it's very much this principle of our interconnectedness, our common humanity. And it's important at this stage to also say that AI actually learns from us as human beings. Its AI does not exist on itself as a separate structure. A very core part of the AI process of developing AI is actually a lot of training back and forth with human respondents. And so those humans actually have to be able to articulate this principle of Ubuntu interconnectedness and Ubuntu in terms of how they program at least the AI machine learning programs that will be utilized in transitional justice contexts. I think that would be an absolutely vital element to be incorporated into all AI working in transitional justice sectors. And then on the AI continental governance AI, the African Union has a set of guidelines that it has adopted on AI, but they're quite dated now. They were adopted in 2024 and are in urgent need for an update, even 2 years after the fact. And I think the issue of environment is only tangentially addressed. It's not a core element in this guidelines that have been established. And so I would argue that, again, in the rewriting of these policies, or even in the implementation of the African Union Transitional Justice Policy Framework, the roadmap for 2026-2029, which was recently adopted and is available online for download, the issue of how AI can contribute towards environmental redress, addressing environmental crime is absolutely central and essential towards enabling societies to deal with the past and to undertake this process of post-conflict reconstruction and development, which is essential to peace building within what is understood the broader transitional justice framework. So that would be my response to that. I think there's still a bit of policy work to be done there, quite clearly, and ensure that interface with the environment, but also with other issues like climate, food security, also are centered in the way we develop policies going forward. So there is a gap there that does need to be addressed. Back to you, Simone.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that comprehensive answer, Professor Dim. I do have another comment and question from Aditi to you, Jenny. So perhaps before you go ahead, I've got another. Okay, so there's two comments, one from Aditi. She says, thank you both for a great way of catalyzing our thinking on AI in this peace building space. In listening to Jenny Lee, it's striking that all the interventions aimed at countering misinformation involved human intervention and not the use of AI to counter some of the ways in which AI is being misused. I wonder if we are being overly positive about the rollout of AI in a global context where there is such little transparency and accountability. All of these benefits we talk of about AI is that these foundational elements are addressed. Wonder if this is a moment to pause for us to consider how to get the foundations right before we use it and help it evolve. And then a comment from Lindiwe. It would be interesting to see how much international courts actually trust AI tools to gather online evidence from social media posts, satellite photos, and witness statements, and whether they will accept such in trials. Over to you, Jenny, if you'd like to respond.
Yes, thanks so much. Those are really brilliant comments, and I really like the reflection in them. So I think AI is obviously developing so rapidly, and it is really scary. But we don't really have control over stopping that, and it's being used for so much bad. So it's same as social media. There are many negative effects of social media. So what we're really focused on is how can we use these tools for good. And I absolutely agree that the humanity has to be the core of that. And that's the core of everything that we do. So you can see how it's really positioned of, there's this incredible work being done on the ground. Communities are at the forefront of preventing violence. And how do we amplify their work that they're doing, their voices, and get that to input into this social media space, which people in South Africa spend, I forgot the exact stat, but I think globally it's like 2.5 hours a day. In South Africa, it's even higher. It's something like 3.2 hours a day. So it's really shaping people's beliefs and attitudes. And how can we make sure that we're inputting our wisdom and our community's wisdom into that and using it as a space for dialogue and reflection rather than as a space allowing people that really have bad intentions to manipulate that space. And I think also what's really core about our methodology is that we're not telling people what to think or what to do, or that we hold the truth. We're trying to get people at scale to critically engage with information online and to self-reflect. And also we really take a really trauma-informed response. So how can we look at root causes of trauma that trigger people to offline acts of violence, or to just share disinformation because it's triggered their trauma. So we're really looking at that self-reflection. And then what do we don't just come up with narratives ourselves. We work very closely with a broad range of communities. What narratives do they want to co-create and then amplify online? Also, the public social media data gives it's a way of deeply listening to thousands and thousands of people. And that really inputs into the process. So definitely the humanity is what's exciting for me. And then the AI and the technology and the social media really becomes, how can we do this at scale? Like if there we we've looked at the social media data, and there's a lot of concern around men having to be providers and keeping in their emotions and all of that, and communities are telling us the same thing and doing work with men on the ground. How can we reach as many people as possible with these messagings, with these reflections, and also how can we acknowledge men and celebrate them for who they are and other things that they're doing? So it's things like that. It really opens up a lot of possibilities that aren't, yes, that really we can use it for good. We need to reclaim that space so it's not being used for bad.
Okay. Well, thanks for that, Janelle. I'm going to hand over to my colleague Felicity. She'll just give us a brief summary before we close today's session.
Okay, thank you so much. I think just amplifying the question that Lindiwe had to you, Professor Tim, around the international system, especially where AI, as it currently has a very Western bias, a very white bias. If you ask, let's say, a ChatGPT to make a poster of people, it generally puts white people, and then you have to say, no, actually, we want to have a diverse range of people. And I think you mentioned it in your talk about making the information much more African centered. I think that my question to you would be, A, how do we do this? And how does this also fit in with our attempts to shift the global order away from the current bias that we see certainly in the United Nations to the global north? And how can we use AI to shift that conversation so that we can have a much more just and equitable society?
Thanks, Felicity, for that question. Yes, and I think also linked to Aditi's question around whether we should, in fact, try to pause and actually figure out what's coming and how it's coming and what we can do about it. Unfortunately, Aditi, it would be very difficult to pause processes that are moving at an exponential rate. And in fact, there's a huge gap in terms of global governance on the issue of AI governance. It's quite massive. It's an emerging issue right now. UN, the United Nations, has issued a number of policy guidelines and so on, but we don't have any system of regulation that actually can roll back or at least regulate efforts to make sure that AI has integrity and is ethical and is not used for harm. And it's some of the leading technology entrepreneurs that actually have been warning us about AI, the so-called tech brothers, but they're also the ones that do not want any form of regulation. because it will limit their ability to do what they're in fact already undertaking. So it's a bit of a paradox. And I did mention the establishment of this World AI cooperation organization. It's the first of its kind, and it's an innovation. I don't think it's very well known right now, and it's not yet a fully universal organization in terms of all United Nations member states. But it is evolving, and I think South Africa has actually signed up to it. Our minister for higher education was in Shanghai to sign on this. So the urgency is to create these guardrails that will actually can protect humanity from what potentially could be quite destructive force, and in terms of how it is utilized. And then linked to Lindiwe's question around whether courts can rely, on data evidence, satellite photos that can actually be manipulated quite effectively by the AI systems we have and machine learning systems we have right now. And again, I think that basically goes back to the question that was raised by Simone earlier around how do we protect against the manipulation of perception by AI. And it really is down to getting primary data, again, from respondents on the ground, real people, work done by real people. So the courts have to send their investigators to the ground and not rely on secondhand information that could be very easily manipulated. So I think that's crucial. And then I think to conclude on the transformation of the global order, as I mentioned, AI is actually one of the issues that actually should compel us to try to create a new system of global governance. The United Nations Charter, which was adopted in 1945 in San Francisco, that makes absolutely no reference whatsoever to AI and also makes no reference to the environment, climate change. So the system that we have right now is in urgent need for an upgrade. And the only way we can have a very broad-based conversation with all members of humanity, so to speak, at least 193 countries, members of the United Nations system, is to invoke Article 109 of the United Nations Charter, which calls for a general conference to review the United Nations Charter itself, to review the whole charter, not just an aspect of it. And it's in that kind of a much more broad-based conversation, and it cannot be vetoed by the permanent five members of the Security Council. And I think it's within that context of that broad policy discussion of how we create institutions for global governance in the future that we can actually have a serious conversation about a truly global system of governance for artificial intelligence, which currently does not exist. We heard of this structure that, as I mentioned, that has been established, the World AI Cooperation Organization, but it's again, it's embryonic and it's not currently universal. And the conversation has not been global in that sense. So we do need to still go back to the issue of creating a system of global governance with global regulatory frameworks and, in fact, laws which can be adjudicated in the International Court of Justice through this Article 109 provision that will trigger a general conference to review the United Nations Charter. So I believe that should be for all AI activists, for all those who are pushing for AI governance. I believe Article 109 is the pathway to actually get to that point where we can sit around as humanity and, in fact, decide on how we are going to regulate AI for the whole world going forward into the 21st century. And I think this is an urgent undertaking that we need to push on because, as I mentioned, the AI itself is growing at such an exponential rate that we are not necessarily going to be able to keep up with it if we just rest on our laurels and let the system evolve, without any kind of guardrails or controls or regulatory frameworks going forward. So let me stop there, Simone. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much. There's no other questions or comments. Okay, it seems as though that is all the questions and comments we have. Thank you again, Professor Tim and Junili. I think we acknowledge that AI presents significant opportunities for documentation, accountability, memorialization, and institutional reform in transitional justice settings. At the same time, it also introduces serious risks relating to bias, surveillance, misinformation, privacy, as well as exclusion. And the central challenge for policymakers and practitioners will be developing governance approaches that ensure AI technologies are deployed ethically, transparently, and in ways that uphold human dignity, accountability, and long-term peace building. But I just want to add to that again, I think this is also giving us an opportunity to also reflect and even address the challenges that already exist there. And one being, if we look at the psychology of things, addressing to the struggles that men face, being a provider, having to not show and express any emotion, and how that plays out in our communities, and not only communities, but those individuals and any individual that has fear, that has trauma, that hasn't been dealt with, are the individuals in our societies. It's each one of us. And that is how we show up in our societies and in the world. And that is where we make our decisions from, our choices, and how we contribute to the world in our societies and in our families, and how we show up for one another. So again, while having to look at governing, putting in those governing or governance in AI and ensuring that is being regulated, we should perhaps also reflect upon ourselves and within ourselves and what AI has actually shown us, and what it is not enhancing, but what it is exposing, and how to address those issues and not neglect it, even with if we do put in regulatory and governance in place, we still need to attend to those other matters. So thank you very much. There aren't any other questions or comments. I'd like to hand over to my colleague Felicity as we close this webinar.
Thank you so much, Simone. As we were just talking, I was reminded of the example of how in South Africa we need to definitely take an interest in and also hold our governments accountable for our own regulatory framework. The bill that was presented a couple of months ago ended up being AI generated itself, with some of the problems that come along with AI generation. So I think we also need to be very proactive in terms of looking at what government regulation is and making sure that the ethical, human-centered requirements are taken into account. I think the point is very well made by both Jenna Lee and by Simone about how online activity does not necessarily promote critical thought. And this isn't just a unthinking element, it's also, it goes down to the neuroscience, and we need to find ways to promote critical thinking online. I think it's also come through very clearly that sometimes we can mistake our own bubbles or the loudest voice for the majority voice, and that is certainly not the case. And I think that we need to be raising awareness online with people who are doom scrolling and spending more than 2.5 hours a day on social media and online, that we need to develop these critical capacities. And I think that this is where Tales of Turning and the work that Jenna Lee and her colleagues is so important. Just in closing, I think that to reiterate what has been said today, that human judgment and ethical oversight as well as strong governance frameworks remain absolutely essential when using AI in justice contexts. Victims and affected communities have to remain at the center of all technological decision making. Transparency, accountability, participation, and respect for human rights should always guide AI deployment. We're going to need an ongoing collaboration between policymakers, practitioners, technologists, and civil society, as well as survivors, and be using all of these stakeholders, and including all of these stakeholders, will be critical to shaping our response to AI governance. The challenge ahead is not whether AI will influence transitional justice, but how it affects transitional justice, and how we will ensure that justice, dignity, and lasting peace can be fostered by AI and not thwarted by it. So I would like to again thank everybody for being here. Thank you to Simone for facilitating. I look forward to continuing this dialogue, but I'm now going to hand over to Simone.
Thank you, Felicity. I think we have come to a close. Thank you again, everyone, for joining us. I hope that you've gained some value out of this webinar today and that we continue to have these conversations and keep in mind the insight that we've gained and how it is that we can take it with us in our practices, in our organizations, in our homes, and in our families, as well as taking it up to government level and yeah, and in everything that we do in our everyday lives. Thank you so much, colleagues, as well, Professor Tim and Gina Lee, for your insightful presentations. I thoroughly enjoyed this your presentations as well as the discussions that followed. I hope that everyone enjoys the rest of your day and that we get to engage in these matters further beyond this webinar. Thank you so much.